Hi, I'm Tom from the Self-Publishing Formula, and this video is all about how to outline a book. Keep watching. Now, of course, there's no perfect way to actually outline a book. It all comes down to how you personally want to go about doing it. Some people like to go into writing a book with nothing more than a premise in mind. They just want to see what flows out of them. And other people prefer to map out every single facet of their world, every character arc, every minute detail of each scene before they even put pen to paper. Perhaps a more pantsing approach benefits stories with a more emotionally character-driven core, whereas maybe a more meticulous approach helps with thrillers with a lot of twists and stories with a more thematic angle. But really it just comes down to personal preference. But if you're the sort of writer who prefers to really get to grips with what your story is going to be before you start writing, keep watching and we'll break down how to outline a story. Okay, so which outline is right for you? First things first, you're going to decide how you want to outline your book. You may want to simply list all the different themes you're going to cover and how, or maybe you want to go into depth about each character and how their arc is going to play out over the story, regardless of the story as a whole. For those experimenting with Game of Thrones style levels of intrigue and subplot weaving, you might want to create a mind map of all your different ideas and plot arcs, etc., and how they're all going to play amongst one another. I personally like to create a sort of time map, sort of showing how I'm going to start from the exposition, go to the rising action, the climax, etc., before reaching the conclusion. It really is just up to you and what your story demands. Regardless of how you approach your outline, there are some questions worth considering in order to make your book as good as it can be. When all is said and done, what is your book actually about? Why do you want to tell that story? And what makes your version of that story different from everyone else's? Who are your characters? How did they arrive in your story? What are their strengths, weaknesses, hopes and fears? And finally, what kind of story structure are you even going for? Are you going for something traditional like the hero's journey, or something a bit more avant-garde and experimental like David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas? Okay, so let's start working on our outline. Let's take the basic story map for our example. Some people call it a plot mountain, some people call it a plot roller coaster. It doesn't really matter what it's called, it's just sort of the basic structure of most books and films. Now this structure, this outline, mirrors the sort of structure of what is traditionally considered the basic narrative, in that it starts with an exposition and establishment of status quo. It reaches conflict or an inciting incident before rising upwards as a sort of rising action. That's basically how your heroes and the events lead up to the main problem. The climax at the top, which is the main problem in itself. Falling action, which is how your heroes and characters try to solve that problem, and that leads to the conclusion and then the denouement at the end, where everything comes to your story's conclusion. Take your time and work out what in your story needs to go where. What will set your character on their journey and why might they at first refuse? What problem will he or she be up against? How will they solve or prevent that problem? And what does their world look like once they've done that? Once you've done this, your timeline will probably still look quite sparse and bare and basic, and that's okay, it will. What you need to do now is not just break it down into parts or acts, but actual individual chapters and scenes. The most obvious thing to consider here is how do your characters get from one scene to another. If at one point they're in a disused car factory in Slough and the next scene they're suddenly in Atlantis, you're probably missing a few points in between. Now eventually you'll have something that looks like an overview of your finished story, just one that's a bit simplistic and unemotional. You could start to work on your first draft now, but it's worth going a little bit further, a little bit deeper into your outline. Take a hard look at each scene in your story, in your outline, and ask yourself, how does that scene actually fit into your story and what does it bring to the table? How does it advance the story in its own way? Make a note of what emotion you want your reader to be feeling during that scene and whether or not it actually does bring the story forward. If that scene isn't essential, you may find yourself reconsidering whether it's even worth having it in there, or maybe you just need to rework it. It's a lot better to know that before you start writing than once you've already finished all 7,000 words of it. Once you've done this, you might find that you have a pretty weighty manuscript in its own right. You'll know every twist and turn, every character decision, every step of the story from beginning to end, but don't get too attached to it. You'll probably still come across problems as you write. There will be little threads of the narrative that will come undone, and the plot holes will rise to the surface. And even if your story is absolutely airtight, your story will change as you write it. In the process of writing your novel, your characters will make choices that you don't expect. The story will go in a new direction. And that's okay. If that happens, you might just want to take a step back and maybe rework your outline. Or you could just go for it. Write a whole novel without any idea of how it's going to turn out. And I'm not being sarcastic here. That's genuinely how some of my favourite stories have been written. And I personally think my own best story was written that way. I had a premise for the twist at the end, and the whole rest of the book I just wrote whatever came naturally, and I think it's possibly my best work. If a writer ends up surprised by how their story turns up, they can be pretty sure that their readers will be surprised too. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how you write your book, and it won't matter to anyone else for that matter. All that matters is that you end up with a book, and a good one at that. Okay, so that was our video on how to outline a novel. If you found it useful, make sure to subscribe by pressing the button below, and leave a comment about how you outline your books, or if you prefer just to pants it and see where the story takes you. Until next time.